The oppressive heat of the South Texas borderlands in August 1889 shimmered off the dusty courtyard of the Laredo County Jail, where rancher Augustus Gus Whitman stood among a crowd of landowners, labor contractors, and opportunists who had gathered for what officials euphemistically called a work assignment auction, but which everyone understood was essentially the sale of human beings into forced labor. Gus operated the Rio Grande Ranch, a sprawling 15,000-acre operation along the border between Texas and Mexico, where he raised cattle and horses, while maintaining one of the few legitimate businesses in a region dominated by smuggling, corruption, and exploitation of desperate people seeking better lives in America. At 52, Gus had built his ranch through honest work and fair dealing, earning a reputation as one of the few Anglo ranchers who treated Mexican workers with dignity and paid fair wages for honest labor. The auction that brought Gus to the Laredo jail represented everything he despised about the way business was conducted along the border. Under a legal loophole that allowed counties to lease prisoners to private employers to cover the costs of their incarceration, local sheriffs had created a system that was indistinguishable from slavery, selling the labor of mostly Mexican and Chinese immigrants who had been arrested on charges ranging from vagrancy to immigration violations. Sheriff Wade Morrison, a corrupt official whose wealth far exceeded what any honest lawman could accumulate on a government salary, served as auctioneer for the monthly sales that provided him with substantial under-the-table income while supplying local ranches and mining operations with cheap labor that had no legal protections or recourse against abuse. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Morrison announced to the assembled bidders, "we have 10 prime workers available for lease today. These men have been convicted of various offenses and are available for work assignments ranging from 6 months to 2 years, depending on the terms you're willing to accept." Gus studied the 10 men who had been brought into the courtyard in shackles, recognizing the mixture of desperation, resignation, and barely controlled anger that characterized people who had been trapped in a system designed to exploit their vulnerability. The prisoners ranged in age from teenage boys to men in their 50s, all showing signs of malnutrition and mistreatment that indicated the harsh conditions of their incarceration. The bidding that followed revealed the callous calculation that characterized the border labor trade, with ranchers and contractors discussing the prisoners' physical capabilities and potential work output as if they were evaluating livestock rather than human beings. The prevailing bids ranged from $15 to $30 per prisoner, depending on age, apparent health, and the length of the work assignment being offered. "Now here's a strong one," Sheriff Morrison said, indicating a young Mexican man who appeared to be in his early 20s. "Miguel Santos, convicted of illegal border crossing, available for 18 months of labor. Do I hear $20? Gus watched as the bidding for Miguel Santos escalated to $28. Won by cattle baron Harrison Fletcher, whose ranch was notorious for working conditions that had killed at least 6 prisoners over the past 2 years. Victory meant that Miguel would face 18 months of brutal labor with minimal food, no medical care, and working conditions that constituted a virtual death sentence. What Gus does next will shock you to your core. Hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories about standing up to injustice when everyone else looks away. As the auction continued, Gus found himself increasingly disgusted by the casual cruelty of the proceedings and the obvious corruption that allowed such practices to continue under the pretense of legal justice. The prisoners were being sold to employers who everyone knew would abuse them, while Sheriff Morrison collected payments that far exceeded the actual costs of prisoner maintenance. But Gus's decision to intervene came when the final prisoner was brought forward for bidding, a Chinese immigrant named Li Wei, who appeared to be seriously ill, and was so weak that he could barely stand without support from the guards who held him upright for the auction. "This one's been sick," Sheriff Morrison admitted, "but he's got experience as a cook and can handle kitchen work. Starting bid is $5 for a 6-month assignment." The lack of interest from other bidders was obvious, since Li Wei's condition made him unsuitable for the heavy physical labor that most employers expected from leased prisoners. It was clear that, if no one bid on him, he would be returned to jail conditions that would almost certainly result in his death within weeks. "I'll take all 10 of them," Gus announced, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard and drawing surprised stares from the other bidders and Sheriff Morrison. "All 10? Sheriff Morrison asked, clearly confused by Gus's unexpected intervention. "Mr. Whitman, that's going to cost you quite a bit of money, and some of these men aren't really suited for ranch work." "How much for all 10? Gus asked, ignoring the sheriff's concerns about the prisoner's suitability for labor. Sheriff Morrison quickly calculated the winning bids for the 9 prisoners who had already been sold, plus a minimal amount for leeway, arriving at a total of $237 for the complete group. "I'll give you $1, Gus said, his offer drawing gasps of surprise and some laughter from the assembled crowd. $1, Sheriff Morrison replied incredulously. "Mr. Whitman, these men represent valuable labor resources. I can't sell them for $1, Sheriff Gus said, his voice taking on the tone of someone who understood exactly what legal ground he was standing on. "According to territorial law, you're required to accept any bid that covers the administrative costs of transferring prisoner. Custody $1 covers your paperwork, and I'm offering to take responsibility for all 10 prisoners immediately." Sheriff Morrison found himself in a legal bind. Since Gus was correct about the territorial regulations governing prisoner leases, while the sheriff had been collecting far more than the legal minimum through his corrupt auction system, he could not legally refuse a bid that met the technical requirements for prisoner transfer. "Mr. Whitman," Sheriff Morrison said, trying to salvage the situation, "I think you misunderstand the nature of these work assignments. These men are convicted criminals who require supervision and control." "I understand exactly what I'm buying, Sheriff," Gus replied. "I'm buying 10 human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity regardless of their legal status." The transaction that followed would be remembered throughout South Texas as the moment when one man's moral conviction challenged an entire system of institutionalized cruelty, setting in motion events that would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of territorial government while demonstrating that courage and compassion could triumph over greed and prejudice. As Gus completed the legal paperwork, transferring custody of the 10 prisoners to his ranch, he could see the mixture of confusion and hope in their faces as they tried to understand what had just happened and what it might mean for their future. "Senor," Miguel Santos said quietly as the shackles were removed from his wrists, "what do you want us to do?" "First," Gus replied, "I want you to understand that you're not prisoners anymore. You're employees of the Rio Grande Ranch, and you'll be treated like human beings, with rights and dignity." Freedom and dignity. The journey from the Laredo County Jail to the Rio Grande Ranch gave Gus Whitman his first opportunity to learn about the circumstances that had led to the imprisonment of the 10 men whose custody he had purchased for $1, and their stories revealed a pattern of injustice and corruption that extended far beyond the auction system he had just challenged. Miguel Santos, the young Mexican man who had been the subject of intense bidding, explained that he had been arrested while trying to visit his sick mother in a border town, charged with illegal entry despite having documentation proving his legal right to cross the border for family emergencies. His 18-month sentence had been imposed by a judge who received payments from ranchers seeking cheap labor. "Senor Whitman," Miguel said, as they traveled in the wagon that Gus had brought to transport the former prisoners, "I have papers that show I was born in Texas, but the sheriff said my documents were fake, and that I was lying about being an American citizen." Li Wei, the Chinese immigrant whose illness had made him undesirable to other bidders, revealed that he had been arrested on charges of operating a restaurant without proper licenses, despite having paid all required fees to corrupt officials who had then claimed no record of his payments. His 6-month sentence had been designed to force him out of business, while enriching the officials who had stolen his licensing fees. The other 8 men told similar stories of arbitrary arrests, fabricated charges, and legal proceedings that had been designed to provide cheap labor for local employers, rather than to serve any legitimate purpose of justice or public safety. Their accounts painted a picture of systematic corruption that victimized anyone who lacked the political connections or financial resources to protect themselves from exploitation. But it was the condition of the men themselves that most clearly revealed the brutality of the system from which Gus had rescued them. All 10 showed signs of malnutrition, medical neglect, and psychological trauma that indicated months or years of abuse designed to break their spirits and eliminate any thoughts of resistance or escape. "How long were you in jail before the auction?" Gus asked the group as they traveled toward his ranch. 8 months, replied Carlos Mendoza, a middle-aged man who had been arrested for allegedly stealing cattle that had actually been sold legally to a buyer who had failed to register the transaction properly. "They gave us 1 meal a day and made us work in the quarry without pay, breaking rocks for road construction." Gus understood that the men's experiences in jail had been designed not just to punish them, but to condition them for the forced labor that awaited them after the auction. The systematic abuse they had endured was intended to ensure that they would accept any treatment from their new employers as an improvement over their jail conditions. When they arrived at the Rio Grande Ranch, Gus's first priority was addressing the immediate physical needs of the 10 men, while beginning the process of helping them understand that their circumstances had fundamentally changed. The ranch's bunkhouse was clean, comfortable, and designed to provide workers with privacy and dignity rather than simply containing them like animals. "This is where you'll be staying," Gus told the group as he showed them through the bunkhouse. "Each man gets his own bed, and there are washing facilities and a kitchen where you can prepare your own meals if you prefer. You're free to come and go as you please, and you'll be paid standard wages for any work you choose to do." The men's reaction to Gus's explanation revealed how completely the jail experience had conditioned them to expect abuse and exploitation. Several of them seemed unable to believe that they were actually free to leave the ranch, or that they would receive wages for their work. Senor asked Pedro Ramirez, a teenager who had been imprisoned for 6 months on charges of vagrancy, "What happens if we want to visit our families or go to town?" "You go," Gus replied simply. "You're free men, not prisoners. The only requirement is that if you decide to work here, you do your job honestly and treat others with respect." Lee Way's medical condition required immediate attention, and Gus arranged for Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, one of the few physicians in the area who would treat patients regardless of their ethnicity or immigration status, to examine all 10 men and provide whatever medical care they needed. "Mr. Whitman," Dr. Martinez said after completing her examinations, "these men have been severely malnourished and have received no medical care for obvious health problems. Lee Way has pneumonia that could have killed him within days if left untreated." The medical care that Dr. Martinez provided revealed the extent to which the jail system had deliberately neglected the health of prisoners, using medical neglect as another form of punishment and control. Several of the men had treatable conditions that had been allowed to worsen to the point where they affected their ability to work effectively. But beyond the immediate medical needs, Gus recognized that the psychological impact of their imprisonment and abuse would require time and consistent treatment with dignity before the men could fully trust that their circumstances had actually improved. "Miguel," Gus said, during a conversation with a young man who had emerged as an informal leader among the group, "I want you to understand something important. You don't owe me anything for what I did at the auction. I didn't buy you to own you. I bought you to free you." Miguel's response revealed both his gratitude and his difficulty in understanding how anyone could spend money to help strangers without expecting something in return. "Senor Whitman, why did you do this? You paid money for us, and now you're giving us food, medical care, and wages. What do you get from helping us?" "I get the satisfaction of knowing that I did the right thing," Gus replied. "And I get the opportunity to work with men who understand the value of freedom because they've experienced what it means to lose it." Over the following weeks, as the 10 men recovered their health and began to understand that Gus's treatment of them was genuine rather than a temporary deception, they chose to work for the Rio Grande Ranch, not because they were forced to, but because they had found an employer who valued their contributions and treated them with the respect that every human being deserved. But their presence at the ranch had also attracted the attention of Sheriff Morrison and other officials who viewed Gus's actions as a threat to the profitable system of prisoner exploitation that they had been operating. The challenge to their authority would soon escalate into a confrontation that would test Gus's commitment to justice and his willingness to defend the men he had freed. The first sign of official retaliation came when Deputy Sheriff Frank Collins arrived at the ranch with a warrant claiming that several of the former prisoners had violated the terms of their work assignments and needed to be returned to jail immediately. "Mr. Whitman," Deputy Collins said, "we have reports that some of your workers have been seen in town without proper supervision. That's a violation of their work assignment conditions, and we're here to take them back into custody." Gus's response would establish the legal and moral principles that would guide his defense of the men's freedom and his challenge to the entire system of corruption that had enslaved them. Deputy Gus replied, "These men are not serving work assignments. They're free employees of this ranch. If you want to arrest them, you'll need new charges and proper warrants, not some made-up violation of conditions that no longer apply." The system fights back. Sheriff Wade Morrison's response to Gus Whitman's challenge to the prisoner lease system escalated quickly from bureaucratic harassment to direct threats, as the corrupt official recognized that allowing one rancher to successfully defy the established order could encourage others to question the entire network of exploitation that had made him wealthy. The pressure campaign began with a series of inspections by various county officials who claimed to be investigating potential violations of health codes, tax regulations, and labor laws at the Rio Grande Ranch. These inspections were clearly designed to find pretexts for shutting down Gus's operation or forcing him to surrender the 10 men he had freed from the auction system. "Mr. Whitman," said County Inspector Harold Bryce during one of these visits, "we've received complaints about unsafe working conditions and possible violations of territorial labor regulations. We're going to need to conduct a thorough examination of your ranch operations." Gus understood that the complaints were fabricated and that the inspection was designed to create problems rather than identify genuine safety issues. But he also knew that refusing to cooperate would provide Sheriff Morrison with the pretext he needed to take more aggressive action against the ranch. "Inspector Bryce," Gus replied, "you're welcome to examine anything you want. You'll find that this ranch meets or exceeds all applicable safety and labor standards." The inspection that followed revealed what Gus had expected. His ranch operations were not only legal, but exemplary in their treatment of workers and attention to safety protocols. The 10 former prisoners were working voluntarily, receiving fair wages, and living in conditions that were significantly better than those provided by most employers in the region. But Inspector Bryce's report, filed with Sheriff Morrison and other county officials, ignored the positive findings and instead focused on minor technical violations that could be used to justify further harassment of Gus's operation. The escalation continued when Miguel Santos was arrested in town on charges of disturbing the peace after he had defended Lee Wei from harassment by several men who had been making anti-Chinese remarks in the local saloon. Miguel's arrest was clearly designed to test whether Gus would try to protect his employees and to establish a precedent for rearresting the other former prisoners. "Senator Whitman," said Pedro Ramirez, who had witnessed Miguel's arrest, "they took him back to the jail." And Deputy Collins said that Miguel's previous conviction makes him a repeat offender who can't be released on bail. Gus immediately rode to town to confront Sheriff Morrison about Miguel's arrest, understanding that the young man's freedom was being used as a test of Gus's commitment to protecting the men he had freed from the auction system. Sheriff Gus said as he entered Morrison's office, "I want to post bail for Miguel Santos and arrange for his legal representation." "Mr. Whitman," Sheriff Morrison replied with obvious satisfaction, "Miguel Santos is a repeat offender with a history of violence and immigration violations. He's not eligible for bail, and he'll be held until his trial." "What's the specific charge?" Gus asked, knowing that the answer would reveal the fabricated nature of the case against Miguel. "Assault and battery against 3 American citizens," Sheriff Morrison replied. "Witnesses say he attacked them without provocation in Murphy's saloon." Gus knew that the charge was false, since Pedro's account of the incident made it clear that Miguel had been defending Lee Wei from unprovoked harassment and had used minimal force to prevent a more serious confrontation. But he also understood that the witnesses Sheriff Morrison had assembled would provide whatever testimony was necessary to convict Miguel and establish a precedent for rearresting the other former prisoners. The legal strategy that Gus developed to defend Miguel required him to challenge not just the specific charges, but the entire system of corrupt law enforcement that had created the prisoner lease program. Working with attorney Margaret O'Sullivan, one of the few lawyers in the region who was willing to take cases against powerful local officials, Gus began gathering evidence of systematic corruption and civil rights violations. "Mr. Whitman," attorney O'Sullivan said as they reviewed the evidence, "what you're describing is a criminal conspiracy involving county officials, local judges, and wealthy landowners. If we can prove these allegations, it could result in federal intervention and prosecution of everyone involved." The evidence that Gus and attorney O'Sullivan assembled included financial records showing suspicious payments from ranchers to county officials, testimony from former prisoners about abuse and exploitation, and documentation of the fabricated charges that had been used to maintain the supply of forced labor for the auction system. But their investigation also revealed that the corruption extended beyond Laredo County to include territorial officials and federal employees who had been protecting the prisoner lease system in exchange for political support and financial considerations. "Margaret," Gus said as they reviewed federal customs records that showed patterns of bribery and official misconduct, "we're not just fighting Sheriff Morrison. We're challenging a network that includes people with the power to destroy anyone who threatens their interests." The federal investigation that resulted from Gus's evidence would eventually expose one of the largest corruption scandals in the history of the Texas-Mexico border, leading to the arrest and prosecution of dozens of officials and the dismantling of the prisoner lease system throughout South Texas. But the immediate challenge was protecting Miguel Santos and the other former prisoners from retaliation while the investigation proceeded. Sheriff Morrison's response to the federal inquiry was to escalate his campaign against Gus, using every tool at his disposal to force the rancher to abandon his defense of the men he had freed. The most serious threat came when Sheriff Morrison assembled a posse of deputies and local supporters to conduct what he called a fugitive recovery operation at the Rio Grande Ranch, claiming that all 10 former prisoners had violated the terms of their work assignments and needed to be returned to custody immediately. Mr. Whitman, Sheriff Morrison announced as his posse surrounded the ranch house, "You're harboring fugitives from justice, and we're here to take them into custody. You can surrender them peacefully, or we can take them by force." Gus's response would determine not only the immediate fate of the 10 men he had protected, but also the broader question of whether corruption and exploitation could be challenged successfully by individuals willing to risk everything for the principles of justice and human dignity. Sheriff Gus replied, standing in the doorway of his ranch house with a rifle in his hands, "These men are free employees of this ranch, and they're under the protection of federal law. If you want to arrest them, you'll need proper warrants and probable cause, not some made-up story about fugitive recovery." The standoff that followed would become legendary throughout South Texas as an example of individual courage confronting institutional corruption, while the resolution would establish precedents that would protect the rights of immigrant workers and other vulnerable populations for generations to come. Justice prevails. The armed confrontation between Sheriff Morrison's posse and Gus Whitman's ranch reached its climax when Federal Marshal Robert Harrison arrived with a contingent of federal agents, drawn to the scene by reports of a jurisdictional dispute that had escalated to the verge of violence. Marshal Harrison's intervention transformed what might have been a local law enforcement action into a federal investigation of civil rights violations and official corruption. Sheriff Morrison, Marshal Harrison, announced as he stepped between the opposing groups, "I'm Federal Marshal Harrison, and I'm here to investigate reports of civil rights violations and interference with a federal investigation. I need everyone to lower their weapons and explain what's happening here." Sheriff Morrison's attempt to maintain his authority in the face of federal intervention revealed both his desperation and his awareness that his corrupt activities were being exposed by the investigation that Gus's evidence had triggered. Marshal Sheriff Morrison said, "We're conducting a legitimate law enforcement operation to recover fugitives who have violated the terms of their court-ordered work assignments. Mr. Whitman is interfering with our duties." Sheriff Marshal Harrison replied, "I've reviewed the federal investigation file, and I have serious questions about the legitimacy of those work assignments and the legal basis for the original convictions. Until those questions are resolved, these men are under federal protection." The federal protection that Marshal Harrison provided for the 10 former prisoners created space for Attorney O'Sullivan to challenge their original convictions, while federal investigators examined the evidence of corruption that Gus had assembled. The investigation revealed a pattern of systematic abuse that had affected hundreds of prisoners over several years. Miguel Santos was released from jail within 48 hours of the federal intervention, after Attorney O'Sullivan demonstrated that the charges against him had been fabricated, and that the witnesses Sheriff Morrison had assembled had been coached to provide false testimony. Miguel's release became a symbol of the broader victory that Gus's courage had made possible. "Senator Whitman," Miguel said, as he returned to the Rio Grande Ranch, "what you did has given all of us our lives back. But more than that, you've shown us that there are Americans who believe in justice for everyone, not just for people who look like them." The federal investigation that followed would eventually result in the conviction of Sheriff Morrison and 12 other officials on charges ranging from conspiracy and civil rights violations to fraud and racketeering. The prisoner lease system was abolished throughout South Texas, and new regulations were implemented to prevent similar forms of institutionalized exploitation. But for Gus, the most meaningful outcome was the transformation of the Rio Grande Ranch into a model of fair labor practices and intercultural cooperation. The 10 men he had freed from the auction became the core of a workforce that eventually grew to include over 50 employees from diverse backgrounds, all treated with the dignity and respect that had characterized Gus's approach from the beginning. Lee Way, whose illness had initially made him undesirable to other bidders, recovered his health and became the ranch's head cook, preparing meals that reflected the cultural diversity of the workforce while maintaining the high standards of nutrition and quality that supported the demanding work of cattle ranching. "Mr. Whitman," Lee Way said during one of their regular conversations about ranch operations, "when I was sick in that jail, I thought I would die alone and forgotten. He gave me not just my life, but also my dignity as a human being." Carlos Mendoza, the middle-aged man who had been imprisoned on fabricated cattle theft charges, became Gus's ranch foreman, using his experience and leadership skills to coordinate the work of crews that included men from Mexico, China, Germany, and several other countries who had found sanctuary and opportunity at the Rio Grande Ranch. The success of the Rio Grande Ranch's integrated workforce attracted attention from throughout the Southwest, with visitors coming from as far away as California and Colorado to observe Gus's management practices and learn about his approach to creating productive cooperation among workers from diverse cultural backgrounds. Mr. Whitman, said Dr. James Patterson, a professor from the University of Texas who had come to study the ranch's labor practices. What you've accomplished here challenges everything that people believe about the inevitability of ethnic conflict and economic exploitation on the frontier. Gus's response reflected both his practical experience and his philosophical understanding of what made successful cooperation possible among people who had been taught to view each other as competitors or threats. Professor, Gus replied, people will work together productively when they're treated fairly, and when they understand that their success depends on everyone else's success. The problems we see in other places aren't caused by ethnic differences, caused by systems that pit people against each other for the benefit of those who profit from the conflict. The marriage that developed between Gus and Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, the physician who had provided medical care for the former prisoners, created a partnership that extended the ranch's influence beyond labor practices to include community health, education, and social services for the broader population of South Texas. Dr. Martinez had been impressed not only by Gus's moral courage but also by his practical intelligence and his commitment to creating solutions that served everyone's interests rather than simply advancing his own position. Their marriage represented a union of medical expertise and agricultural knowledge that would benefit the entire region. Dr. Martinez said as they planned the expansion of medical services for ranch workers and neighboring communities. What you started with those 10 men has created something that goes far beyond a successful business operation. You've demonstrated that moral principles can be practical principles when they're applied with intelligence and determination. The children that Gus and Dr. Martinez raised at the Rio Grande Ranch grew up in an environment that prepared them to be leaders in the continuing struggle for civil rights and social justice. Their bilingual education, multicultural experiences, and understanding of both American and Mexican perspectives made them natural bridge builders in a region where cultural cooperation was essential for long-term prosperity. The legacy of Gus' decision to spend $1 to purchase 10 prisoners extended far beyond the immediate impact on those men's lives. The federal investigation that his evidence had triggered led to reforms that protected the rights of immigrant workers throughout the Southwest, while the success of the Rio Grande Ranch provided a model for labor practices that demonstrated the economic benefits of treating all workers with dignity and respect. 20 years after the auction that had changed everything, Gus stood in the same courtyard where he had purchased 10 men for $1, attending a ceremony to dedicate a memorial to the victims of the prisoner lease system and to celebrate the reforms that had been implemented to prevent similar abuses in the future. 20 years ago, Gus said in his speech at the dedication ceremony, 10 men were being sold like cattle in this courtyard. Today, their children are doctors, teachers, business owners, and community leaders who are building a better future for everyone in South Texas. Miguel Santos, now a successful merchant and community leader, served as the master of ceremonies for the event, introducing speakers who had been affected by the prisoner lease system and who wanted to honor the courage that had led to its abolition. Mr. Whitman taught us that the price of freedom isn't measured in dollars, Miguel said to the assembled crowd. It's measured in the courage to do what's right when everyone else is looking the other way. If this incredible story about one man's courage transforming an entire system moved your heart, smash that like button and subscribe for more amazing true stories about ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that individual actions can create massive change when guided by moral conviction. Comment below and tell us about a time when someone stood up for what was right despite the personal cost. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest inspiring stories. Remember, the price of freedom isn't measured in money, it's measured in the courage to treat every human being with dignity. This remarkable story reminds us that some of history's greatest victories against injustice have been won not by armies or governments but by individuals who were willing to risk everything to defend principles that transcended their own immediate interests. Gus Whitman's decision to spend $1 to purchase 10 prisoners was motivated not by economic calculation, but by moral conviction that human beings should never be treated as property. The transformation of the Rio Grande Ranch into a model of fair labor practices and intercultural cooperation proved that treating people with dignity and respect was not just morally right, but also economically smart. The success of Gus's integrated workforce demonstrated that diversity could be a source of strength, rather than conflict when people were given opportunities to succeed together. The federal investigation that resulted from Gus's evidence gathering illustrates the power of individual courage to expose and challenge systems of institutional corruption. One person's willingness to document and report abuse created the foundation for reforms that protected the rights of thousands of vulnerable workers throughout the Southwest. Perhaps most importantly, the story shows that the effects of moral courage extend far beyond the immediate situation that prompted action. The men whom Gus freed from the auction system became community leaders, whose influence continued to promote justice and opportunity for future generations, proving that investments in human dignity always pay dividends that exceed their initial cost.